Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to my content. I'm going to start by giving a shout out once again to my good friend Firaz, who has continued to support the channel via Patreon and has made an additional request for a video topic for me to discuss. Now, people who are new, or perhaps you may have just missed previous videos, will know that this is not the first Mike Tyson request I have done for Firaz. I did one 2 months ago on Mike Tyson and how he would fare against the modern day heavyweight elite, the Anthony Joshuas and Wilders of this world. I did one last month focusing on a prime versus prime, Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield, and how I thought that would go. If you haven't already seen those, you may find it interesting to check those out before you watch this video, because we'll probably continue to explore some of the themes raised in those videos as we go through this piece. The best way of doing that, I'm not sure. I'll try and maybe include a link in the description box if I can't get around to doing that because I'm uploading this off my phone or whatever. If you type into the YouTube search bar, Boxing Gossip Mike Tyson, I'm sure they'll come up right at the top and you can check them out. But anyway, in this piece, Firaz has requested that I discuss a peak Mike Tyson, 1985 to 1988, versus a peak James Buster Douglas, 1990. We'll get into it in a second. Let me say that I believe a peak Buster Douglas was very much what we saw in the Tyson fight. You know, from my watching and my reading of Buster Douglas's career, and I have to acknowledge at this point that a number of Buster Douglas's key fights were prior to my arrival on this planet. But there was never a James Buster Douglas performance to the same standard and to the same level that he displayed in that Tyson fight. Never before, never afterwards. So, peak Buster Douglas, very much what we saw in the ring. Peak Mike Tyson, which is something we've discussed at length in the previous Mike Tyson videos, kind of defining 1985, 1988, that sort of period, obviously when he was first winning unifying titles, etc., etc. I can't be the only boxing fan who is also a music fan, and my interest in this fight was actually peaked in 2017 when one of my favourite bands, The Killers, released a song which actually I really enjoyed called Tyson versus Douglas. Now, I'm not going to make this video about music, so I appreciate people are tuning in to to hear about boxing. But Brandon Flowers, the lead singer of The Killers, who wrote Tyson vs. Douglas, said in an interview with BBC, Mike Tyson was perfect to me. He created such excitement around the world, but he lived in Las Vegas and got my family excited. He went on to say, my paradigm shifted when he was knocked out. He was one of my heroes. I saw that he was impenetrable. He was impregnable. He was iron. He was a man and he was fallible. His personal life, things went out of control after that. I think a lot of people go through those experiences, whether it's their dad, their musical heroes, could be their sports heroes, whoever you're looking up to, and seeing them go down like that. So for Brandon Flowers, who actually references a number of boxers in his music, there's another one of his songs, Run for Cover, which includes a line about Sonny Liston. But for Brandon Flowers, who obviously watched the fight as a very, very, very young person indeed, it was like a sort of life-defining moment. For him, it was a moment that has affected him, throughout the course of his life and career, and he kind of always thinks back to that fight because it was such an upset, such a shock to see Mike Tyson, who was, in his mind, completely unbeatable, take a loss to a guy like Buster Douglas. The chorus of the song goes, when I saw him go down, felt like somebody lied. I had to close my eyes just to stop the tears. Recommend you check it out. But anyway, let's stop with the Killers references now. I guess this fight is probably best known as being one of the biggest upsets in heavyweight boxing history. From a bookmaking perspective, Buster Douglas went into this fight at 42-1. Now, to give you a comparison, David Price, and I've just looked this up at the time of recording, which is on the 16th of February, David Price is available with the majority of the high street bookmakers, the big high street bookmaking names. He's available to beat Alexander Povetkin at 7-1. So in other words, the bookmakers give David Price 6 times the chance to beat Alexander Povetkin as they gave James Buster Douglas to beat Mike Tyson. They thought Tyson losing to Douglas was 6 times less likely than David Price beating Alexander Povetkin. So that tells you just what an upset this was. As the fight began, I've rewatched the fight prior to making this video. The commentary team, I think it was Ray Leonard and Larry Merchant. I think Larry Merchant starts by saying the commentators, he's saying the world would be shocked, or most of the world would be shocked, if Douglas even made it to the second half of the fight. So Douglas was going into this fight a tremendous underdog, and he was going in against a guy who was probably hyped more than any other heavyweight you can imagine. From my reading and my research on the subject, the sort of public perception and hype around Mike Tyson, the dwarfs even the perception that we've had about the likes of, Anthony Joshua, for example. Tyson was viewed as a wrecking ball. He was viewed as unbeatable. And he was coming into this fight as an unbeaten fighter. He was 37-0. He was fighting James Douglas, who was 29 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw. And the last time Douglas had been in a title fight against Tony Tucker, he'd actually been stopped. So Douglas was written off in the lead up to this fight. He had some advantages over Mike Tyson. He was a bigger guy than Mike Tyson. He was 6'4". He was 230 pounds. I believe his reach was over 10 inches longer. There were advantages in the Douglas camp, but based on the fact he'd taken those losses, based on the fact he'd been stopped before, based on the fact that Mike Tyson was viewed as just such a devastating fighter, Douglas starts this fight at 42-1. And I think throughout my upbringing as a boxing fan, and spending time talking to other boxing fans and speaking to people in my family when I was growing up, Douglas versus Tyson is always the reference point that people come back to when we're talking about upsets in the sport of boxing. I remember when Hey Bellew happened last year. Tony Bellew scored the biggest upset since Douglas Tyson. Hasim Ratman scored the biggest upset since Douglas Tyson. It's just that sort of point that kind of sticks in boxing fans' memory as like one of the biggest upsets in the history of our sport. So where are we? So Tyson comes into the fight, huge favourite. Perhaps a concern, he's overlooked Douglas. It's a warm-up fight. It's deemed a warm-up fight for Evander Holyfield. Holyfield's ringside for the fight. They'd already talked numbers. They'd already talked the sums of money that was going to be involved in that Holyfield-Tyson matchup back in 1990. And maybe Tyson was guilty of looking ahead. He'd had some changes in his corner. It had been, Kevin Rooney had left earlier on in his career, but, maybe he hadn't had a testing fight subsequent to that Kevin Rooney departure. Rumours that he got dropped by Greg Page in sparring. Unlike the Tyson, we all sort of think of, getting dropped in sparring. And rumours that he had come in very, very overweight for the fight and actually had to, go into a bit of a fat camp and lose a lot of weight when he was out in Japan where the fight was held, in order to come in at his normal fighting weight, which was, closer to 220 pounds. So, perhaps some signs that Mike Tyson very, very guilty of overlooking Buster Douglas. Maybe he was enjoying his celebrity. Maybe he was guilty of looking ahead to Evander Holyfield. Maybe he just didn't think Douglas was good enough. There were problems outside of the ring, beginning in Tyson's life and continuing in Tyson's life during this period of history. And as with all Mike Tyson discussions and videos, you of course have to reference that those problems outside of the ring seem to take something out of Mike Tyson's career. So the fight begins, and Douglas really takes a good lead. Funnily enough, at the time of the stoppage, one of the judges had Tyson well up, one of them had it even, relatively even, one of them had Douglas well up. As an aside, Buster Douglas may well have been on a road to getting robbed in this fight because for me, from a scorecard, prediction, it's very hard to have Tyson up in this fight. Douglas comes out and he wins some of these early rounds quite comfortably. He wins some of these early rounds by a decent margin. Douglas is looking good early on in this fight, and what we see him do is establish a jab very, very early on. And I guess the Buster Douglas jab has kind of gone down in history after this fight. But we see Douglas get the jab going, and it's a hard jab. One of the commentators in the fight compares it to a Larry Holmes jab. They talk about how Douglas has dropped previous opponents with his jab, and you can see that. He commits to it. He throws it with real force and power. He uses it well as well. It's quick. He doubles it up. It's a really, really, really valuable weapon. So he uses the jab. He also uses a variant of the jab and grab style. I mean, not to the same extent that we saw Klitschko use it against Povetkin, for example. But we see Douglas doubling up that jab, making Mike Tyson eat punches on the way in, and then look to tie him up. At other times, as Tyson comes in, rather than panicking, Douglas sets his feet and continues to throw, meaning that Tyson eats 4 or 5 punches before he gets into range. So that is a sort of key determining factor in the early part of the fight. Douglas, in many ways, fights like a big man should fight against Tyson. Tyson, a smaller guy, short, stocky and powerful. You're going to want to keep him off you. You're not going to want to let him get on the inside. You're going to want to use distance and range. We see Douglas doing that. We see him using movement. Maybe he was looking at the James Tillis fight, where James Tillis caused Tyson all sorts of problems that I flagged in one of my earlier Tyson videos. And very much it's that combination of movement, jab, double jab, catching him coming in, closing down, holding, stifling. Douglas is doing all of that in droves. At the end of round 4, Douglas's corner tells him he's 4-0 up. And you know what? Having rewatched the fight today, find it hard to really disagree with him. Larry Merchant on commentary for HBO says that is probably the best round I've ever seen him fight, referring to Buster Douglas in the first round. Now, one of the reasons surrounding this fight that is kind of cemented in folklore is Buster Douglas's mother, who I believe he was very close to, passed away in the lead up to this fight. And there's kind of the suggestion that Douglas has gone into this fight feeling like he's got nothing to lose, so emotionally charged up by the loss of his mother that there's no fear factor behind Tyson. And usually Tyson's one of these guys who people say he had beaten his opponent before he even got to the ring, because they were so scared of him, so scared of the power, the style, the ferocity he brought to the equation. Douglas was one of the few fighters who stood up to Mike Tyson. And I think what Douglas did is almost a halfway house between what Evander Holyfield did by standing up to him and by not being bullied by him, combined with what James Tillis did by frustrating him and moving around him. Those were, if you like, the two kryptonites to Mike Tyson, in my humble opinion. And Douglas kind of did a combination of the two. In my Tyson versus Holyfield video, I speculated that Tyson was a very, very good on-top fighter, whereby if he was allowed to bully you, if he was allowed to implement his style against you, he was really an unbeatable force. But if you stood up to him, if you pushed him back, if you refused to be intimidated, and if you refused to allow him implement his game plan, there was no plan B. In this fight, we see shades of that again. We see Mike Tyson becoming low volume. We see him throwing less punches than we associate with Mike Tyson in the early rounds. We see him continuing to eat punches, and we see him looking a bit forlorn and a bit frustrated in the corner between rounds as he struggles to adapt and struggles to find the answer to the puzzle that is Buster Douglas on that night. It was very, very, very tough work for Mike Tyson. And for me, my sort of biggest criticism of Mike Tyson looking back on him is that he is a guy who becomes frustrated, and he is a guy who is very reliant on implementing his style. And if he's unable to do that, like he was against Buster Douglas in this fight, then he's not someone who can reinvent himself mid-fight and come out with a different look. So I guess that's my take in all. This is a good example of styles making fights. And on that night, for that Buster Douglas and that Mike Tyson, Buster Douglas fought a very, very, very good fight and displayed the perfect style to beat a fighter like Mike Tyson, for my money. Now, controversially in the fight, I forget which round it is now. Is it round 8 perhaps? Tyson drops Buster Douglas. And as I was growing up, it was always explained to me that Tyson dropped Buster Douglas and Douglas was down for longer than the 10 count. But he was allowed to continue fighting. He was allowed to stay in the fight. The referee gave him a debatable decision. And it was kind of given... I've always kind of heard the story that Tyson should have won the fight by knockout due to that punch. And, Douglas had a bit of a lucky escape there before he came back into the fight to win. Douglas, who's on top in the fight in this point, leaves himself a bit open to getting countered. Mike lands a huge uppercut on the chin and Douglas goes straight backwards. Now, was Douglas down for more than 10 seconds? In my opinion, yes. Probably 12 seconds, 13 seconds, something of that magnitude. However, the failing here is not of Buster Douglas. From the TV footage that is available on YouTube, you can clearly hear the referee counting and signalling to Buster Douglas. 1, 2, 3. It's clearly audible from the footage. From about the 5 or 6 count, you can see Douglas looking at the referee. You can see him listening to the count. You can see him reading the referee's fingers. And as the count becomes longer, you can see Douglas starting to get up, starting to get to his feet. For my money, Douglas is reading what the referee is. He knows he's hurt. He knows he's been hit by a big punch. And he decides to read the referee and get up at the last possible moment to give himself enough time to recover. My viewing of the fight is that if Douglas needed to have got up 1 second earlier, he could have started his ascent back to his feet that 1 second earlier. I think if the count is slow, that's not Douglas's fault. I think Douglas has taken the time that the referee indicated he had, and I think Douglas has got up in line with that. It was also right at the end of the round, so Tyson didn't actually have any opportunity to land further punches on Douglas in that round. So I wonder, in hindsight, is that slightly overstated? All Douglas did is what any other experienced heavyweight boxer did, which was take the time the referee was indicating he had. And then Douglas got up, and it was the end of the round, and Tyson didn't have any more chance that round to go to work. So I think it's a bit harsh that fight kind of goes down as Tyson kind of should have won because of that knockdown that went over 10 seconds. Yes, maybe it was a slow count, but Douglas has read the count and got up at the last possible moment. And I could not conclusively say that he wouldn't have been able to get up 1 second earlier if the referee had started 1 second prior. That's just my take on it. But I understand, obviously, that's controversial. Now, clearly this fight represents the peak of Buster Douglas's form. The question is, does this fight represent the peak of Mike Tyson's form? And I won't touch on that in too much detail because I've covered that in previous videos. But my take on this one is very much that Tyson was at his peak 2 or 3 years earlier. Could I see substantial decrease in capability from Buster Douglas? Could I see substantial decrease in Tyson's game in the Buster Douglas fight? Possibly. I think the head movement was very noticeable. His head movement was noticeably worse. I think his fitness was arguably worse. I think his speed had decreased slightly, especially when he was sort of coming in. And I think he was a slightly less dynamic and slightly less explosive fighter than he was in his early days. So, do I think a peak Mike Tyson was considerably better than the Mike Tyson we saw against Buster Douglas? Yes, I do. And if you combine that with the fact he was getting dropped in sparring, that he'd had a change of personnel in his camp, there were rumours he'd come into Japan very, very heavy for the fight, that he had all those personal problems outside of the ring. If you combine those factors, I do think we can say with a high level of probability that Mike Tyson in 87 and 88 was a considerably more dangerous fighter than the Mike Tyson in 1990 who fought Buster Douglas. Should Tyson be embarrassed by the defeat? Not for me. Not for me. Buster Douglas fought a great fight. Buster Douglas fought a style that was the absolute kryptonite to Mike Tyson. And Buster Douglas potentially goes down as an underachiever. Yeah, if you look at that Buster Douglas in that ring that night, based on that performance, he deserves to be in the conversation of the Lewises, the Tysons, the Holyfields, the Bows. You know, when we look back at that era, we talk about Riddick Bowe, we talk about Evander Holyfield, we don't talk about Buster Douglas in the same light because he underachieved. He didn't perform to that same level in other fights. But based on what he showed that night, he was a fighter who had the potential capability to be discussed at that sort of level. So Tyson lost to a very good fighter. He lost to a fighter who put in a career best performance. And in that fight, Tyson, despite losing on the scorecards for me, dropped his opponent very, very heavily. And also, he took some hellacious punches from Buster Douglas. If you watch that round where Tyson gets stopped, the heart, the determination, the chin, the resistance Tyson shows to even stay in the fight that round, is a sight to behold. It really is. Nowadays you don't tend to see beatings like that. Typically the referee jumps in earlier. Is Buster Douglas an all-time great fighter? No, he's not. Based on other things I've seen on him, he wasn't able to replicate this level of form at any other point in his career. Does he have a great chin? People are asking. I think from what I've seen, Buster Douglas is a guy who has more been undermotivated. You've seen him kind of fold in fights, almost, more find a way out of fights. You've seen him come into fights very, very heavy. He came in against Evander Holyfield very, very heavy. The first loss in his career was very, very heavy. He's a guy who didn't really do himself justice. He did himself justice in the Tyson fight, but he could have put up a lot more of a fight in some of his other, matchups when he fought Evander Holyfield, etc. So the question is, who would have won the rematch if there'd been a rematch in 1990? Who would have won a fight if that 1990 Douglas fought a peak Tyson? Well, if you stuck a gun to my head now and asked me who would have won an immediate rematch, I would probably go Mike Tyson. Whilst I think Buster Douglas did have all the tools to beat Mike Tyson, and whilst I think he delivered a style that was almost perfect for Tyson on that particular night, I believe that was a once-in-a-lifetime performance from Buster Douglas. I believe he was not capable of replicating that level of form again. As we saw in his subsequent matchup with Evander Holyfield, for example, where he let himself down. And I believe that the circumstances surrounding, his mother's death, etc., probably in Buster Douglas's case, I'm not saying this would be the case in every case, but probably in Buster Douglas's case, created emotion and created a sort of persona going into that fight, which meant he was capable of dealing with what Mike Tyson brought to the party. Had the fight been on a different night, or had there been a rematch, looking at Buster Douglas and his inconsistency, the likelihood is he wouldn't have been able to replicate that form. So, if you're asking me who would have won a rematch, I'd probably go Mike Tyson, because I don't believe Buster Douglas had it in him to do what he did in that fight again. If you're asking me who would have won between that Buster Douglas in 1990 versus a peak Mike Tyson, I actually find that a much harder question. I find that a much, much, much harder question. I think the public opinion, the sort of standard opinion, the most popular opinion, is that a peak Mike Tyson would have absolutely destroyed a guy like Buster Douglas. Having said that, and as I've referenced in previous videos, a peak Mike Tyson was frustrated by Mitch Green. A peak Mike Tyson was given all he could handle by the length and the movement of a guy like James Tillis. He could have lost that fight against Tillis. What we saw from Buster Douglas was what Tillis brought to the equation and probably quite a lot more in terms of offense, in terms of power, in terms of um, offensive jab, etc. So I cannot sit here and confidently tell you that a peak Mike Tyson definitely beats a peak Buster Douglas, because I believe that even a Mike Tyson at his very, very, very best um, is a guy who is very vulnerable if he can't implement his style, and is very vulnerable to a guy who can keep him off and use distance and stand up to him and close him down a bit on the inside. I believe that's Tyson's ultimate kryptonite, as was found out on more than one point of his career as his career elongated. However, yet again, I use the phrase, if you put a gun to my head, I would pick Tyson of 87 to beat Douglas on 1990. It would probably be a 60-40 pick. If you ask me who I think would win the rematch, I'd probably go 75-25 Tyson, because I don't believe that Buster Douglas could have shown up again. But if you're saying that Buster Douglas turned up again in a theoretical fantasy match against a peak Mike Tyson, I'd probably make Tyson a 60-40 favourite. I believe a peak Mike Tyson would still have been vulnerable to some of the attributes that Buster Douglas brought to the ring, just like he was against James Hillis. But we've got to be cognizant of the fact that the 1990 Mike Tyson hurt Buster Douglas and very almost beat Buster Douglas, despite all the problems he was suffering with, and despite the extenuating circumstances outside of the ring. This was a Mike Tyson who didn't have the speed, the explosiveness, the defensive capability, the head movement of a younger Mike Tyson. This was a Mike Tyson who didn't have the same team around him as a younger Mike Tyson. And I believe those factors would have made the 1987-1988 Mike Tyson marginally better and big enough to bridge that gap against the peak Buster Douglas. As an aside, I also believe the corner team were pretty average from Mike Tyson's perspective in that fight. They didn't really give him a variety of advice. They didn't really show any versatility. They didn't really give him a change of tact or direction midway through the fight. I read that they turned up to the fight without the appropriate equipment. They didn't turn up with the iron that you use on a swollen eye to help with the swelling. Instead, they had to fill a plastic glove with ice cubes and hold it to his face. They weren't prepared. Their advice wasn't up to standard. I also read that, Tyson got an injured eye in the Douglas fight. I also read that at one point they had this glove full of ice and the guy had a chain around his neck. The cornerman had a chain around his neck, and he's actually put the glove full of ice on Tyson's eye, and the chain has been caught up against the side of Tyson's face and up against Tyson's eye, and that has, worsened the injury for Mike Tyson. So I don't think the corner work was up to much. I think the earlier setup he'd had, maybe with Rooney, would have given him different advice, handle things differently in the corner. And I think that could have made a big difference as well. So for me, the peak Mike Tyson would have been a bit faster, would have probably taken less shots from head movement, would have probably been fitter, wouldn't have had to lose weight in a fat camp, and I believe he'd have had different advice. And that means that I narrowly side to Mike Tyson. But I don't think it's the easy fight that people do. You read about it on the forums, people say peak Tyson ends peak Douglas in 30 seconds. I don't think so. He didn't end peak Tillis in 30 seconds. Douglas was bigger than him. He had a better jab. He kept Tyson at range. He had good movement for a big man. He stood up to Tyson in a way that Holyfield did later on in his career. He caught Tyson coming in. He was able to hold. He was strong. He had a will to win. He did a lot of things that made life very, very difficult to Tyson. Pete Douglas versus Pete Tyson, it's a competitive fight. It's a fight that will go either way. But I'll side with Mike Tyson narrowly. I think Tyson would have taken less punches, and I think he would have found a home for his power earlier and asked some more serious questions of Buster Douglas throughout the entirety of the fight. That's my take. Let me know your thoughts. Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe, please hit the thumbs up button. As always, appreciate you guys tuning in.